Okay, I'm going to talk with you about fractions, give you some picture examples, talk about vocabulary. We're going to look at a ruler, and just get into the basics of what a fraction is and how to write it. And then I'll make other videos about operations with fractions. Okay, so I'm going to basically, a fraction is a number that is less than 1 and a number that is between 1 and 2 or between any whole numbers. So let's look at a ruler just for a minute here. Here we have a ruler. Now the 0, we don't put 0. Usually there's just a line, and on this ruler it's on the edge of the ruler. So notice that if this were 0 and this were 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, those are all whole numbers. But then we have these little tick marks in between. And notice that the spacing on these tick marks are equal. So each tick mark represents a space preceding that tick mark, okay? And so we could have a number, like say if I were to draw a line and it's going to go to this point here, okay? So notice that my line is less than 1 whole inch. But you know, I want to know how much that represents, how much that distance represents. And so we could use fractions to determine the actual measurement for numbers that are less than 1, which is kind of cool. Now each of these tick marks represent an amount, a fractional amount. And if you notice, there are 15 of these little tick marks. If you were to count them all up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then the big one here, the 1, would be considered 16. So there are, and the reason is it is considered as 16 is because, remember, the line represents the space preceding it. So this line represents all of this space. So we would have 16 sixteenths, or 1, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But each of the tick marks, like I said, represent a space before it. So if I were to measure this amount, looks like I have about 13 sixteenths. Okay, and that's okay if you can't really see it up close, but this line represents a number that is less than 1, and that's the main thing I'm trying to say. So let's move this down and let's draw another line. Let's say that my line represents a space that is more than 1 and less than 2. And so again, fractions can also be fractions can also be written as mixed numbers, meaning they have a whole number attached to a fractional amount. In this case, I would say that's a 1 and 1/2. So we have a full 1, and then if we were to count our tick marks, we would actually have 8 sixteenths, and I know that to be 1.5. And again, don't worry about reducing. I'm just talking generally about fractions. So we can have a fraction that represents a number less than 1 and more than 0. Okay? We can also have a number that represents a number more than 1. Okay? Now, so these are two types of fractions. This one here would be referred to as a proper fraction. here, proper fraction. And then the one including the whole number with the fraction would be considered a mixed number. And it's mixed because you have a whole number attached to a fraction. Okay, we'll talk more about how we got reduced later, but first let's look at some pictures of fractions. And we'll talk about some vocabulary along the way. So in this exercise, we're going to write down the fraction that represents the shaded amount. And in doing so, I'm going to share with you a little bit of info about fractions in general. Now, notice that we've got an object here, or a figure. This happens to be a square, and within the square, it's broken up equally, and that's the key word, equally, or equal parts. Okay, so you can see there's 4 equal parts, 4 equal squares, meaning they're the same size. Okay, so our bottom number is going to tell us how many equal parts make up a whole. Okay, it's also going to tell us that each unit is representative of a fraction of the whole. So if we need 4 equal parts to make a whole, each part is going to equal 1/4 of the whole. Okay, it's hard to see with the black. Now the top number is going to represent the shaded amount, or the amount that we're considering in the problem at hand. So in this case, we want to write a fraction that represents the shaded parts, and that's going to be 3, because there are 1, 2, 3 1/4, or 3 parts of the whole that are shaded. Now the top number has a special name. It's called the numerator. Okay, and again, that's going to tell us the number of parts that we're considering. The bottom number is called the denominator. And again, that's telling us how many parts are needed to make up the whole, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it also tells us that each part is an equal amount, and that it's just a fraction amount. So if there's 4 needed to make a whole, then each part is worth 1/4 of that whole. Notice in the second one, we've got a circle, and also these are broken up into fourths, 4 equal parts. So again, each part is worth 1/4. Okay, but the numerator, which is the amount that's shaded, or the parts that we're considering, there's only 2 shaded parts here. Okay. Now let's go ahead and look at this third one. How many parts are shaded? 0. None of them are shaded. And what would be the denominator? There's 8 equal parts. So each of these represents 1/8. And you don't have to, write out these fractions when you're doing these problems, but if it helps to see what's going on here, certainly you can do it. So there's 8 equal parts. Now I keep stressing equal because you might have, let me draw a circle over here. Say we want to represent 1/3 as being shaded. But what if I had some divisions like this, and then I shaded this little part here? This picture does not represent this fraction, because this fraction is assuming that each part is going to be an equal piece. And in this case, that is not that is not correct. Okay, these pieces are not equal. So this setup does not represent this fraction, and that's really key. That's the equal part is very important when considering fractions. Okay, let's do a couple more. Again, we've got 4 parts. 4 parts make up a whole. 1 part is shaded. And this last one, we have a circle. Looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 parts make up a whole, and they are equal. And I have 3, and 3 is 6. 6 parts are shaded, 6/8. Now I'm going to write these in 1/8 because I want to share one thing with you before we move on to the next worksheet. Notice how this fraction 1/8 looks when we compare to 1/4. Okay, 1/4 looks bigger than 1/8. Even though the denominator, and that's our bottom number here, even though the denominator is smaller for the 1/4, the pieces are larger. And if you think about it, it only takes 4 parts to make a whole. So each part is going to be bigger when compared to 1/8. In this 1/8, the piece is smaller because we need 8 of them to make up one whole. So we're going to have smaller slices if we're going to break this circle into 8s. And oftentimes people get a little confused by that. They think the 4th, 1/4 and 1/8, when they're comparing those two, they think the 1/4 is smaller because of the smaller number versus what that 1/4 represents. 1/4 is a larger amount when compared to 1/8. Let's look at some other types of fractions here. In this worksheet, we're looking at excuse me, we're looking at the whole. So each circle represents a whole. So if we just look at this circle here, that's considered one whole. So here we've got 1, 2, 3 holes. Okay. Now we're only identifying the parts that are shaded, and we're going to represent that in a mixed number. Notice that each of these 3 circles are divided into 2 equal parts. So this is 1/2, this is 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, and so on. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 1/2 pieces. Okay, now, but what we want to do is we want to first look at how many whole pieces we have. Okay, so we have 1, 2 whole pieces, and that's where our whole number comes into play, and we have 1/2 of a whole. Okay, 1/2 of a whole. Looks like this one is hard to see. I'm going to skip this one for now because that's just visually hard to see. Let's look at this third one here. Here we have 3 circles, and each circle is broken up similarly. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8s, 1/8 piece in each one. And I'm just going to write that here. I'm not going to write that in on all of them. So we've got 1 pie, or 1 circle, 2 whole circles. So again, we're going to write 2. And the reason we're not doing writing 3 is because this one we only have a fractional amount. We don't have the whole pie. But we have 1 1/8, another, so 2 1/8, 3 1/8, oops, 4 1/8, and 5 1/8. Okay, so we have 5 8s. Moving on to this one, we have 1, 2, again 2, and these are broken up into fourths, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's what's needed to make a whole. Same here, same here. We've got 1/4, 2 fourths, and then 3 1/4. So 3 fourths, 2 and 3 fourths represents this amount. Again, we've got, looks like these are eighths again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Notice we have 3 8 8/8. This would be 8/8, 8/8, 8/8. So that's 3 whole pieces, and we have 1/8, 2 1/8, and 3 1/8. So that would be 3/8. And the last one on this, notice we break up the circle into 3 equal parts. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 2 whole pieces, and then 1/3 and 2 1/3. So it's 1, 2, 2/3. Okay, and so this is how we would write mixed numbers. Notice that the mixed number has a whole number and a fraction is attached to that whole number.